Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one we see that the Russians have managed to advance several areas across the eastern section of the front line. The Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Velyka and Novosilka, gaining full control of it. They've also managed to storm Andriivka north of it, gaining a foothold within the northern outskirts of the town and gaining control over significant fortified positions in the area. The Russians also managed to advance further westward, southwest of Pokrovsk, as they continue their offensive towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians also managed to advance west of Pokrovsk in the direction of Udashna and north of Kudlina. The Russians also managed to advance north of Novosilka directly towards Pokrovsk itself. And the Russians have managed to capture the majority of Krymske, gaining control over 99% of the city of Toretsk, including Krymske. Starting out in the direction of Velyka Novosilka, we see that the Russians managed to capture the southern parts of the town while gaining control over the apartment complex area in the northern outskirts, which is just a few of them. This allowed the Russians to gain full control over the area and plant the flag at the strongest point. At the same time, the Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining parts in the northern parts of the town, clearing out the past few days of heavy fighting in Velyka Novosilka ended with the Ukrainian forces taking heavy casualties from their encirclement, and now we see the fighting will move on to the fortified lines north of Velyka Novosilka as the Russians will start pushing across the river line in the northwestern direction and start offensive operations northeast of Velyka Novosilka in the direction of Rostlev, Konstantinopel, and Behatir. Now that the Russians are also storming Andriivka from the northern direction, they managed to push through the fortified positions west of Shevchenko and Petropavlivka, as they're now pushing along the fortified areas towards the northern outskirts of Andriivka. And we saw the earlier geolocated footage, which allowed the Russians to have a foothold in the northeastern outskirts, which indicates that they have control of the majority of the fortified positions in the area. And with the recent control over Yasenova and Novoandriivka in the outskirts of it, fighting over the remaining parts of it, it is likely that the Russians will soon gain full control over the highway between Pokrovsk and Andriivka, and the strength of the Russian forces storming the town will increase. The town itself is not a easily defensible one, with the Russians from the northern direction flanking the town completely, exposing its weak points. And at the same time, the town itself is mostly just residential buildings. There's no apartment complex area. There's hardly even any schools, malls, or there's no industrial area. This means that the Russians will likely capture this town not with a strong, large grouping of forces, but rather with small groups of infantry and some squads, which will move through buildings after buildings. And it's not going to be a large force taking control over Andriivka, it's going to be a small one, simply to limit the casualties taken as much as possible. The Russians will likely use the captured positions in the northern direction as the main fighting areas, but they'll capture one fortified position after another, whereas after which they will send their troops to take control of them and hold them, to defend against Ukrainian counterattacks from the southern direction or from the western direction, after which they'll send a few squads in different areas of Andriivka to gain control over the buildings and swipe them one after another. The biggest challenge for the Russians will be to gain control over the fortified positions east of Andriivka, as it is a circular one with firing positions within the central parts and trenches all the way around. However, the Russians will likely encircle those forces through the bypass in the north, which will allow them to gain control over the remaining parts, encircling the Ukrainian forces in the area, and the Ukrainian forces there will not be able to defend over a long period of time. Russians look to gain control of the remaining parts of Andriivka, hope for the Ukrainians to attempt a breakthrough and then exit through either the southern bank of the Vovcha River line, push through there, exposing themselves out in the open fields, or attempt to push through Andriivka, which again will expose them due to the Russian control of it and the flank of their positions. Therefore, we see that the Russians have managed to push through the northern parts where they've taken control over areas that are less defensive, because they'll have an open and, as in the northern direction, the northern flank being exposed, which the Russians took advantage of, moving through the forest areas, flanking it from their weak points, and then gaining control of them one by another, then with a few high-speed, high-maneuverable vehicles such as motorcycles, ATVs, or even electric scooters to gain a foothold within the town with a few infantry groupings, and this has allowed them to start the fight over Andriivka itself. Further north, the Russians have managed to gain control over further parts of Andriivka as the fighting over the town continues, and the Russians have also managed to advance south of it, gaining control over some of the forest lines in the area. The Russians are here expanding their footholds to flank the towns around Krymske, Novosilka, and so on towards the Pokrovsk region. The Russians are doing a pincer maneuver on a wide angle where they, through the push through Andriivka, has managed to gain a foothold on a residential area in the area, allowing them to concentrate more forces and to push down in the southern direction to flank Krymske from the north as they continue their pressure on Novosilka by not storming it directly, but instead limiting their escape route to Krymske and exposing them in case they attempt to withdraw further on, and this will allow the Russians to gain control over town after another. If the Ukrainians were planning on having the same forces withdraw from one town to another to continue their defense, then they would be limited significantly by these flanking maneuvers, which would inflict more casualties on the Ukrainians during such a withdrawal, and therefore they'll be able to capture the next town following after the next town at a faster pace every single time, as the Ukrainians will take casualties every single time until the Ukrainians send new resupplies, new reinforcements to the area. And as we can see, the road network here is very extensive. There's roads to multiple towns from multiple directions, and it's all connected through the northern direction and the southern direction. If we take a closer look at the area, we'll see that the Russians, through the push along the northern and southern flanks, would be limiting the supplies of the Ukrainian forces in the area, as the Ukrainians would not have that many roads from the western direction, as the majority of the roads goes in the northern and southern direction and not in the western direction, because there's a large gap between the towns in the area. This means that if the Russians advance along the northern flanks and the southern flanks of these towns, then they would be operationally encircled and they would have no roads to resupply. Therefore, attacking on the flanks is much more valuable for the Russian forces, and it will expose the Ukrainian forces to the weaknesses of these towns. Further north, in the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to advance north of Kotlina and to the northwest of the village. Following the capture of it, this has led to the Russians capturing a forest line to the north of Kotlina and this choke point to the west of it, as the Russians advance towards the industrial area north of Dashne and expand their zone of control around the highway and railway to push towards the northern highway and railway towards the city of Dnipro in the Dnipropetrovsk region, which would further isolate the city of Pokrovsk from supplies from the western direction, leaving only off-roads connecting them directly. Gaining control over the industrial area would allow the Russians to have a strong outpost and defensive position west of Pokrovsk, which will allow them to concentrate more forces in the area, create a strong defensive line west of Pokrovsk, and to expand the zone of control in the northeastern direction towards the railway and highway. The Russians will likely look to gain control over the fortified positions on the second line of defense west of Pokrovsk, gain full control of it, and have that as a defensive line, while at the same time gain control over the industrial area and Udashne, which will further secure their positions here to the west of Pokrovsk, which will allow them to start offensive operations towards Pokrovsk itself from the southwestern direction, and then move onwards towards Ryshine and the general fortified position area in the northwest of Pokrovsk, not to attack Pokrovsk from this direction, as it would be an extremely difficult operation. Instead, their focus would be defensive in nature, where they would look to create a strong flank and defend their positions in the area to prevent a Ukrainian counterattack from freeing up their forces in the city of Pokrovsk, while the main force will be pushing from the southwestern direction through the towns and through the highway and railway here to the west of Pokrovsk. While at the same time, we now see that the Russians have started offensive operations north of Novosilka, gain control of the remaining parts of the fortified lines southeast of the city, and to move along the railways, both in the direction of Mirnorod and Pokrovsk itself from the southeastern direction, expanding the offensive operations from the southern direction and the southeastern direction. The Russians have also managed to advance in the northern parts of Toretsk, where they've managed to gain control over the majority of Krymske, leaving only a small area remaining under Ukrainian control along the industrial area and the residential area in the east. With this, the Russians almost have complete control over Toretsk and the surrounding urban areas, which will lead to full control of the Russian forces of the area, remaining only the fortified positions and the surrounding towns from gaining under Russian control, which will lead to the Russians launching new offensive operations towards the reservoir south of the city of Krasnohorivka. We see that the Russians have managed to continue the offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line, with the focus being from Toretsk in the north to Velyka and Novosilka in the south, and with 100% full control over Velyka and Novosilka, offensive operations will now go into the new stage, which will look to gain control over the border area here to the northwest of Velyka and Novosilka. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.